Altoona, Pennsylvania, a railroading hub for Norfolk Southern in the northeastern United States, with a giant locomotive shop and a bustling main line full of traffic. One location you'll recognize is the iconic Horseshoe Curve, a popular rail fanning location in the state of Pennsylvania. If you watch trains there, you'll see mile-long freight trains climbing the hill with modern GEs on the front. But on the back are a pair of locomotives assisting the train uphill with the sound of their mighty engines. These are the SD40Es, which were the backbones for helping trains up the slopes of Pennsylvania. Once problematic units, they were rebuilt and have served a major purpose on keeping the freight moving for NS. And this is their story. Our story takes us all the way back to the late 1970s. EMD had been building hundreds, if not thousands, of SD40-2s for America's railroads, as they were selling like hotcakes. However, when competing against General Electric's more powerful C30-7, they decided to go bigger and better with a new model. In December 1980, EMD introduced the SD50, a planned successor to the SD40s. They were equipped with an enhanced version of the 645 prime mover, alongside a longer hood and frame, an increase in horsepower, and newer electrical systems. So, in some regard, they seemed to be a good successor, and were the perfect one-up towards General Electric. However, if you know your history, you will know that the SD50s were nothing more than shit. The powerful engine led to crankshaft failures one after another, electronics were prone to malfunctioning, and there were many reports of faulty cooling systems of some units. All these problems were results of EMD being under pressure and trying to cut corners in production. As a result, railroads had to fix the many problems, with some sources stating the electrical system was a headache to work with. Ultimately, the SD50 would be viewed as a locomotive to kill EMD's reputation as the top locomotive builder, as from that point on, GE would dominate the locomotive market even to this day. In total, 431 SD50s were built for 12 railroads across 3 variants. Conrail would be the largest buyer of the SD50s, with a total of 135 being built in total. The railroad at the time was recovering from the recession, and with the Staggers Act in place, Conrail was beginning to turn a profit after a rather rough start. The railroad already had a fleet of worn-out and beat-up predecessor locomotives, and replacements were already underway to have a more modern, up-to-date fleet. Conrail was already purchasing EMDs since 1976, with many SD40s and SD40-2s arriving on the railroad since 1977. However, with the discontinuation of the SD40-2s, Conrail instead chose to get the next best thing in line, the SD50. The railroad would begin ordering them in 1983, with the last ones arriving in 1986. There were many distinguishing features on these units, which included the addition of cab signals, classification lights on the nose, and what is called interital filter screens at the back. Some of these units would even receive HT-C trucks later on, and even one was fitted with a shock absorber as a test towards the newer HT-C trucks. Like literally anything I've covered in this series, the fleet would be placed alongside the SD40s on mainline trains, so again, regular working lives despite the SD50's problems. 2 units would even receive special liveries during their Conrail years. 6707 was painted with a yellow ribbon as a sign for Conrail support during the Gulf War in 1991, and 6726 would receive a paint job to commemorate the Olympic cycle time trials in Altoona. So on the contrary, Conrail's SD50s had a bit of character and variety in their appearance. Hell, even when more reliable locomotives arrived on the Conrail, the SD50s kept on going, which is kinda saying something. When the Conrail split happened in 1999, the fleet would be divided by Norfolk Southern and CSX, with 78 going to NS and 57 going to CSX. This would expand both railroads' fleet of SC50s, as both railroads would have their own fleet of SC50s which were either second-hand or factory fresh. For those that went to NS, the ex-Conrail SC50s would be renumbered into the 5400 series and continued handling freight trains across the NS network. It is said that only a few of them were repainted, while the rest essentially just had the Conrail livery, albeit with the patch marks, which was pretty typical for NS during that time. However, by the new millennium, the SC50s were slowly being displaced by more powerful units, with many newer and reliable locomotives from EMD arriving, like the SC70Ms and the SC70M-2s, which began handling the most of the mainline freight trains. And coupling that with the SC50's problems, and most of them being in their 20s, NS had locomotives ready for their disposal. But then, a new opportunity showed up. Starting in 2008, NS would begin a rebuild program for the tired SC50s, which would result in the creation of the SD40Es. Many newer rebuilt parts would be featured in the rebuild program, which included a fixed version of the 645 prime mover, newer microprocessors and electrical equipment, alongside a refurbished cab with air conditioning included. Alongside being refurbished, they would be derated from 3,500 horsepower to 3,000 horsepower, essentially just making them slightly bigger SC40-2s in some regard. Coincidentally, the derating was also applied to the SC50s on CSX. The first SC40Es would emerge from Juniata in November 2008, with rebuilds continuing all the way until 2014, when the last member, 6357, would be outshopped. So, in total, 10 of NS's own SC50s were rebuilt, 46 of the Conrail SC50s were also included, and even 2 SD40Ss were also rebuilt, which were a shorter version of the SC50s that were only on the Norfolk and Western. Although, not all SC50s were rebuilt, as quite a few ex-Conrail NS-owned SC50s would be sold off for scrap, so not every SC50 was lucky in some regard. So, if we add up all of the SC50s that were included, this meant that 58 SC40Es would be a part of NS's roster moving forward. And instead of putting most of the units on road trains, however, they would serve a unique purpose on the network. NS would put most of their SC40Es as helper units on the Pittsburgh line, as one of very few locomotives to be assigned to this role. You see, many trains tackled the busy but hilly main line throughout the years, and multiple locomotives were set up as helper units over the years. From Eiiwun decapods to Baldwin centipedes, to the SC40-2s that continued well into the days of Norfolk Southern. Throughout the 2010s, the SC40Es would be the backbone of the Pittsburgh line, shoving trains up and down the hills of Pennsylvania daily. And whenever you went to Horseshoe Curve, 10 times out of 10, you would see a pair of these assisting a train or returning light power down the main line. Some SC40Es would even handle work outside of banking duties, from handling locals to rescuing Amtrak trains, handling work trains to occasionally leading road trains out on the NS network. But for the most part, the SC40Es were the backbones of the Pittsburgh line, and would continue serving NS well into the new decade. However, while they continued banking even into the days of PSR, a new opponent would arrive. The SC70 ACUs were rebuilt SD90 Max that entered in service around 2017. The ACUs had newer cabs and newer Mitsubishi's electrical components, but aside from that, they were still problematic 90 Max. While they first started out as road units, by the 2020s, the ACUs would slowly be employed to helper service on the Pittsburgh line, displacing the SC40Es from the regular duties. The contrast between both of these locomotives are noticeable, as the ACUs had more horsepower and tractive effort, and were AC powered compared to the lighter and DC powered SC40Es. Given the ACU's strength and size, they could use less helper units on most trains. For example, if there was a long coal drag for instance, they would need 2 pairs of SC40Es to assist the train, but with the ACUs, it would mostly be a single pair. With these contrasting differences, the ACUs would begin taking over helper duties, and by the beginning of 2022, the last SD40Es would retire from their helper duties. So, where are the SD40Es now? Are they all stored? Were they sold off to another railroad? Were they all purged and sold for scrap because of some incompetent CEO? Well, no. Following their displacement, the SD40Es would be reassigned to local freight trains, and were primarily seen on the northeastern or southeastern side of the NS network. Much like the SD40s and SD60Es, the SD40Es were amongst the few locomotive models to survive through the power purge, with the fleet still continuing to serve with NS to this day. Honestly, I feel like there was an exception made to keep these around, seeing as they did serve a vital purpose to their operations. What about those on CSX? Well, much like their NS counterparts, they were also derated and still continue to serve CSX on various jobs, so it's nice to know that the Conrail C50s, at least those remaining, are still kicking on even after the split. The thing I find kind of interesting about these locomotives is that the SD40Es outlived their successors. Ever since the SD50s were built, more successful and reliable EMDs would come out. SD60s, SD70s, even SD80s were built, and were proven to be more capable and more reliable than the SD50, and coincidentally, a handful of them were owned by NS. And yet, in a bit of a weird twist of events, almost all of them were retired by the 2020s, which is a bit ironic since, by technicality, the SD40Es, which were failures when built, they are still with us. Hell, even the ACUs, which displaced them, despite a handful being in service, half of the fleet was sold off in 2020 due to NS's incompetence, while all the SD40Es are still around. Ironic, isn't it? In conclusion, the SD40Es had a rather interesting career. Starting out as failures, to surviving the company's split, to being rebuilt, becoming helpers for a busy rail corridor, and now having a laid-back career on locals. It's surprising really that they managed to last all the way into modern day, and even outlasting the most modern EMDs. They served a vital role on Norfolk Southern by serving the hills of Pennsylvania, shoving trains up and down on a daily basis. They kept NS's network going, even if they were underpowered. Had they been retired in 2020, then the story probably wouldn't be as interesting. They may not be as glamorous as like a Heritage unit or as powerful as something like a Jivo, but that doesn't really matter. All that matters was they were capable of doing the work given to them, even after the displacement, really. It's surprising to know, though, how even a simple rebuild can result in a successful future.